Mhm. All right. Hi to everyone that's just joining in right now. We're just going to let a couple more people come in before we get started. Thanks for being here. All right. I think I'll get started then. So hi everyone. My name is Rachel. I'm super excited to have you here at our first webinar in the Solutions at Scale Environmental Education series. I work with Reforest London, and I currently work at the Westminster Pond Centre in London, Ontario, which is being developed as London's first centre for environment and sustainability. So I just want to acknowledge that the land on which I live and work is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, and Lenape peoples, nations which have longstanding relationships with the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. We extend our recognition to our neighboring First Nations communities, the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation, who continue to steward the land today. We also acknowledge the treaties of this area, such as the London Township Treaty of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum, among others, which have influenced the history of relationships between settlers and Indigenous people. Seeing as we're all treaty people, we should take the time to learn about the contemporary and present stewards of the land we call home and work towards reconciliation. So on that note, I'm very excited to welcome our speaker, Brandon Williamson, to our sort of virtual stage. So if you don't already know, Brandon is the land management coordinator for Upper Thames River Conservation Authority. He's responsible for managing over 5,000 acres of land in both rural and urban environments, including active and passive conservation authorities, wetlands, forests, floodplains, agricultural lands, and urban natural areas. He draws on his 25 years of forestry and land management experience, working with community partners to provide forest management, ecological restoration, risk management, enforcement, and invasive species management. As a registered professional forester and ISA arborist, he understands the importance of balancing the management of natural heritage features while fostering strong relationships between the Upper Thames River Conservation Authority, partner municipalities, Indigenous communities, community groups, and all levels of government. So the last thing before I hand it over to you, Brandon, just a couple of housekeeping notes. I believe I have it so that everyone stays muted throughout this presentation. We are excited for your questions, so feel free to pop those in the chat throughout the presentation. And we'll have the Q&A at the end where I can ask those questions on your behalf, or we can converse through the chat that way. And lastly, just wanted to say that this webinar is being recorded. Nobody's face or name will be shared on our social media or anything like that. It's just so that we can share this content with more people who weren't able to make it today. So thank you very much for being here. Super excited to have you be a part of this first Solutions at Scale webinar. And over to you, Brandon.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Introduction, I guess, bio, I need to shorten that up a little bit. But anyway, I'm here to talk to you about invasive species management, sort of in a changing climate, so to speak. And I've put together this presentation a few years ago, and sort of every year I kind of tweak it a little bit and adapt it for different groups and different situations. But just want to preface this by saying that, invasive species management is not a one-off sort of program or initiative. And what I mean by that is that it's sort of depending on your situation, the actual physical environment you're dealing with depends on your personal beliefs and preferences on invasive species management, invasive species as a whole versus native plant and wildlife species, herbicide use, mechanical use, your ability to harness labor and volunteers and paid labor and all those things that go into it. So it's not just a one stage approach, and each entity, each organization group is going to look at invasive species management slightly differently. So this is the perspective that we've used and adopted over 25 years plus of trial and error, and good news, bad news, funding opportunities, loss of funding, all this kind of thing. So anyway, I'm just going to get rolling here, and then hopefully we've got lots of time for questions after. So a little bit of an overview. I'm going to look at the invasive species impacts, some of those impacts that we can see across the landscape, some of the pathways where they get here, and then when they arrive in Ontario and Canada and our region, how do they spread around? Look at some of the management cycle of how we approach invasive species management. Look at a little bit about planning. I've got a few different species, examples of species, how we control them, some identification features, and some reasons why they're some of the major species we deal with. I'll talk a little bit about monitoring and restoration, and then just give some final thoughts. So I use this definition from Ontario Invasive Plant Council, of which I am the president of the board of directors for OIPC. So definition of invasive species that we use is an alien species whose introduction or spread negatively impact native biodiversity, the economy, and or society, including human health. So there's umpteen different definitions, but that's kind of just to give you a perspective as to where we're at with that. So invasives are one of the biggest threats to biodiversity in the landscape, right? Whether it's native or non-native plants, both can be invasive, although we mainly refer to invasive species, invasive plants, invasive wildlife as non-native to our region, right? Southwestern Ontario, Canada. They can be terrestrial or aquatic. They can be wildlife, including insects, fungi, either a terrestrial or aquatic, etc. There's a whole host. Those are just a few of the examples of invasive species that we're talking about here. I'm going to focus a little heavier on invasive plants a little bit later on, but the same methodologies, I'll say, can be applied across the invasive spectrum. So why is there so much focus on invasive species? Because they reproduce at an extremely high rate compared to our native species, and that can be the case for wild pigs, wild boar, or buckthorn, right? They have vigorous growth habits. They're adapted to grow in a wide variety of mediums and climate conditions, whether it's different soil types or whether it's different terrain. When you consider something like Asian carp or wild boar, right? Or hemlock woolly adelgid, right? So they outcompete native species for water, nutrients, sunlight, space, essentially, right? And all the components that go into that space. Plants in particular have one aspect of the invasives that make them even, more difficult to control is they're allelopathic, which is basically a biochemical effect from one plant to another. So some people know about black walnut trees and the juglone chemical that all parts of the black walnut trees give off. You can't plant your vegetable garden right next to a black walnut tree. It just will have a really tough time growing. Spruce tree or pine or cedar tree right underneath the drip line of a black walnut tree will be really difficult to get that going because of that biochemical in the soil. Invasive species, plants will often have that allelopathic nature to them. So and invasives are also a vector for other harmful pathogens. So you get one invasive insect in, and that could lead to a virus that could attack that species or that plant or that tree, right? So, or you could have an insect that will bring in a pathogen, right? Wild boar can go in and scrape a landscape, clean a landscape off, and that may make it more susceptible for garlic mustard or periwinkle or buckthorn to come in. So while the wild boar is taking out a lot of tree species and displacing wildlife, it also could bring another pest into that area. So they are becoming more widespread across the landscape, potentially due to climate change. I mean, we haven't had hardly any winter in our region, except for maybe a week and a half, early January and today. But other than that, the fact that we don't get many cold temperatures anymore compared to 25, 30, 40 years ago is a big issue for a lot of invasive species, and especially the forest pests. So they're becoming more widespread and there's more of them, right? So just for perspective, we currently manage 25 plus 28 different invasive species, and that would be plants and forest pests. Ecological impact. So we've got a few different impacts. These are not all of the impacts under each heading, but it's just sort of a highlight a few. So definitely there's a decrease in species diversity when you talk about invasive species, which creates that monoculture environment. And when you create a monoculture, that creates all kinds of problems for healthy wildlife populations. It takes several decades or more for wildlife to adapt to a different invasive species. And that all can lead to collapse of ecosystems, right? And complete changeover of a certain ecosystem type when you have invasives that are heavily populated enough. And I mentioned that monoculture development. When you get a monoculture, it increases the potential for insect and disease infestation, because if one species is dominant and then that species gets killed off for some reason, flooding, sun scald, all kinds of other environmental factors, then it wipes out the entire area, and then you're left with a blank canvas for other invasives to come in and take up that space. So it changes soil chemistry. So you go in and do an invasive species removal project. Well, you might not be able to plant or do restoration in there very successfully for several years, depending on how long that invasive has been in there, how allelopathic it is, and how dense that stand was before you did your management. So it's not just simple to say, oh, let's remove these 4 hectares of buckthorn and go plant the next year. Probably not going to have great survival rates the first year after planting, because it takes time for that soil chemistry to adapt and change. There's huge economic impact, not only the cost of the actual management itself and the restoration that goes along with it and the monitoring and the planning. You're talking about industry impact. So, and potential collapse. You can look at, the commercial logging industry, especially out west in British Columbia with the, pine beetle, emerald ash borer in Ontario, massive hit to the logging industry here, with ash being such a predominant species in that commercial sector. Commercial fishing. Zebra mussels was the big issue back in the 80s, and now we're talking about Asian carp. So huge impacts to those industries, the livelihoods of those people involved in that industry, and there's so many other off industries or offshoot industries that are affected as well. There's a big social impact, recreational opportunities, so tourism, decreased property values and aesthetics. You talk about the Phragmites along the Georgian Bay and Huron, Lake Huron coastlines. Those cottages, a lot of those provincial parks and beaches along the Lake Erie shoreline at Long Point, all those lagoons. Not only is there a massive ecological impact, there's also the social impact with tourism affected and decreased property values. And there's also health and safety concern. The change in the biodiversity of a woodland, of a forest, of an area, from healthy mixed hardwood stand or a prairie stand, and you change that to monoculture of buckthorn or dog strangling vine, that can affect mental health 100%. So there's lots of studies have proven that getting out into nature and in those environments, listening to the birds and seeing wildlife can really have a really positive impact on mental health. And if you decrease that wildlife population and you decrease the biodiversity, huge impact on mental health. There's also issues along roadways with line of sight. We know that from Phragmites is a good example. Japanese knotweed is another one that grows along roadsides, can create traffic issues, and then fire hazards as well. Those are just 3 examples within the health and safety realm, but lots of different impacts that invasive species have. So introduction and spread, how do they get here? Well, you'll notice I've highlighted in red a couple of the areas that are the same and then one in particular that is different between the two. So introduction, how did they get to Canada? Well, natural dispersal, so wildlife, wind, rain, flooding, all the sort of natural pieces that will move invasive species throughout the globe, basically, and the continent. Human pathways, transportation. So you see that cargo ship in the corner there. We bring in thousands of shipping containers a year and thousands of ships to ports, and they're all supposed to be treated a certain way, but they're not always done that way. So lots, and with global trade being so huge now, you look at the transportation industry is just huge for bringing invasive species in to our area. Urban sprawl, 100%. We all know that has lots of environmental and ecological effects, but big time effect on the introduction of invasive species. As well, international trade, which is a social behavior. Essentially, it's how we trade. We want things quick. We want things fast and easy, and that is definitely an issue for introduction of invasive species. Now, once they get here, they disperse the same methods: natural dispersal, humans, urban sprawl, landscape, horticultural industry. That kind of mimics the international trade piece, but the one piece that's missing is the reproduction through seeds, roots, cuttings. You know, though that's a so once they get here, there's all these challenges on how to prevent them from get here. But then we have this extra challenge of the reproduction of the actual plants or the wild boar, the wildlife, or the insects themselves. So those are all barriers to managing invasive species. I highlight the social behavior piece because those are really important pieces that we don't often talk about. Is, once they get here, well, how can we change, the beliefs about what we use in our landscape or horticultural industry, or what we use in the fishing industry, how we dump the ballast water, all these types of things. It's definitely an issue, and a lot of people are sort of working on it, but there's a lot of money involved in those industries, so it's not an easy change. Now, what I call the management cycle is just sort of how we look at managing invasive species. So the first thing is prevent them from even coming here, prevent them from spreading. So we have to change social behavior. We have to look at planting native species, the right plant, the right place. Where can we plant them? What can we plant? Ontario Invasive Plant Council has a great campaign there. I think it's the bottom right of your screen there, the Grow Me Instead pamphlet, and it gives options of species that you can plant instead of invasives, right? So, instead of periwinkle, you can use running strawberry, or you can use a native clematis. And those are great options for ground covers as opposed to periwinkle. So, for example, when they get here, changing social behavior, but then tighter regulation on trade, and that's international and unintentional imports. So the tighter regulation I mentioned before, a lot of those crates and packing containers need to be treated, but they're not always done that way. So that's a big big hurdle as far as prevention legislation. The Invasive Species Act has just gone through a little bit of an update, but again, some say that act may not have the teeth that it needs to, so to speak. And it's really difficult, when you're asking folks to take on an additional responsibility of enforcing an Invasive Species Act as well. So, and then just greater education. So that's what these types of webinars are all about. Once it's here, you have to detect it. So you have to do inventory, proper inventory. You have to know what you're looking for as well. So that's a lot of research as far as identification features and ecotypes that these species will grow in. So, do your inventory, document it, report your sightings. You can use EdMaps as well. There's other apps, that you can use to upload those species identifications that you have that can be vetted and that can, provide a database for property managers to go to and look at and try to find out where we need to go to put these management plans in place. And then just engage people, making everybody aware at a local and regional level of what the species are, Dog strangling vine might not be as big a deal up in Sault Ste. Marie, but they're going to have some other forest pests up there that'll be different from down here. So making everybody aware at that local and regional level is really important. And then our response as a collective. And I say plan, 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 because that's huge. You have to develop the management plan with clear objectives as to how you want, what's your outcome after you do that management, and then engage people, various folks in the community as early in the planning process as you possibly can. That's really key. Is to get as many people involved. Money. I mean, you can't do any of this stuff without money. So, having that management can be really expensive. So there are government grants, there's funding programs out there now that really help out with that. So that's a really important piece that was missing even as 3 or 4 years ago. There wasn't a lot out there for on the ground funding opportunities. So looking for those opportunities is really key to helping to get your management program off the ground, and then just make it happen. Follow through with that management plan. So don't even enter into that plan unless you have a clear path and clear objectives and a group that's behind you. Having that plan, apply for these grants, you get those grants and funding programs in, and then just follow through with that management plan. The control stage. So once it's here, you've found it, you've got a plan together. Now you're going to put your plan in action. That's make sure you know your control options, the pros and cons of all different options, right? Consult the public, engage, do some education, put up signs, go to the media. If you're using herbicides, don't be afraid to put that out there. You're going to get kickback, and that's fine. Whether you're using mechanical, chemical or other, there's always going to be two sides of the story. So as long as you get it out there, chat it out, figure it out, and that's engage folks in the community. Follow the legislation, Species at Risk Act, the Ministry of Conservation Parks. They have a lot of those permitting and different processes you need to go through, especially if you're using herbicides. Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, they have some processes to go through. Invasive Species Act. So look at those different pieces of legislation and apply them to your plan. Obviously, anything you do has to have highest safety, right? So whether that's training, personal protective equipment, best management practices, technical bulletins, anything you can get to on your, get your hands on for utmost safety for everybody involved, whether it's you doing the work or the public in that area. So as I mentioned before, you can use EDMAPs. So that's early detection and distribution mapping. Ministry of Natural Resources and OFAH, I think, co-manages that program. You can take a picture, upload your species, put it in that program. Someone will verify it, that it is that species, and it goes on a larger map across the province so practitioners can look and see, it just gives us an idea, a database of where species are. Make sure that inventory is up to date. And then it's essential to design a plan, and we'll go through all of these things. This is just sort of a step-by-step. Organize your data, get your GPS and your mapping, document it, and just remember throughout this process, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen, right? So figure out your control phases, do your public consultation, reference all those BMPs and all those legislation requirements. Monitoring is huge. Before you even look at tree and shrub planting or any type of restoration, look at a monitoring plan as well. And then put together a final report. You may need to go back to the community public consultation again. So that's really important as a wrap up. I'm going to go through a few species here. 224. Okay, so I've got a few species we'll go through here, just with identification, why their impact is so great, what makes them so invasive, a little bit about the pros and cons of a few different control methods that we use. And then I've got highlight a few other species at the bottom here that we do often control. But I would say that the ones in the larger font here are the majority of the species that we end up managing, other than I'll say maybe emerald borer, which is kind of sort of in decline in our area. So I'll start with European and glossy buckthorn. I mean, it's all over Southern Ontario. If you go up to Halliburton area or north of there, they don't have a lot of buckthorn up there. So, a lot of their forestry programs and woodlands are in great shape as far as invasives, but definitely it's prevalent across this part of the province. The best time to look for it is probably in October, November, if you're not so sure of what it looks like, because it's going to be one of the only green trees in the woodland at that time of year. It holds onto its leaves right into the first snow, basically. Often has its berries on the tree as well if it's a fruit-bearing tree. So spreads very rapidly. Usually it's a bumper crop of seeds every single year. And all parts of this plant can reproduce, whether it's root fragments, seeds, branches, that kind of thing. It'll adapt to a wide variety of growing conditions. So, on the left is common or European buckthorn, Rhamnus cathartica and Rhamnus frangula, which is the glossy buckthorn at the bottom. The glossy buckthorn is mainly likes the wet feet, so wetter, swampier areas, but it will grow in high and dry and vice versa for common buckthorn. So it's very adaptable to growing conditions compared to a lot of our native tree species, which some of them have very specific growing conditions. The seeds of these plants are root viable in the soil for years. And of course, they are allelopathic. So some of the control methods we have used over the years, we've used the mechanical method, pulling, where you can see the weed wrench that we use in the top right, which, there's no soil contamination. You don't have to worry about, having licensed herbicide applicators in that regard. There's no license required, so it's very safe in that regard. There are some negative impacts though. If you have a large, heavy, thick, dense stand, the impact on the soil can be really detrimental, because you're uprooting all of that soil, pulling the seeds from the seed bank up to the surface in a position to be germinated really readily by the sun, because the canopy is gone because you just pulled it out. And oftentimes what we find in those really dense stands is that that seed bank is full of buckthorn seeds. So you just basically reinvent that sort of buckthorn stand. Really labor intensive. And the timing is critical as well, because you don't want to disperse the seeds when you pull that plant out of the ground. So really effective for smaller single stems or smaller sparse stands. 100%, that's really effective. You'll see the picture in the top middle there where a root broke off. Certain soils, heavy clay soils, it's really difficult to pull buckthorn out, because if the roots break off, then that root that's left in the ground will just grow and create the same problem you just tried to remove. So on the other side, herbicide is what we use often, and you'll see the bottom picture there with the dark color stain on the lower bark. And we basically just spray that lower bark with a herbicide. It's nearly 100% effective. You don't get that soil disturbance. You don't get that seed dispersal. When you pull the species out, it's cost efficient. However, it does require licensed exterminators. There is that herbicide component in certain areas. So, near a sensitive, that's really highly sensitive habitat, or right adjacent to a walking trail or things like that, you have to consider all those in your plan. And there is a potential for some soil contamination as well. Although we don't, do a widespread foliar spray with this, it's very concentrated to the stem. There is a potential for soil contamination as well. So it just depends on your ability to harness a lot of labor force to go back to those sites to do the pulling, and whether or not that's going to be effective. We'll flip over to dog strangling vine, one of the more aggressive invasives that we have in our area. Again, it is allelopathic. So this on the right here is a picture of a monoculture of, this is a fantastic site because we have a monoculture of, I say that sarcastically, of dog strangling vine in the understory. And then you'll see on your left side of that right picture, and there's a huge mature buckthorn. So we've got buckthorn over dog strangling vine in this case. Not an ideal situation. It does prefer those open prairie sites and savannas and other sensitive ecosystems. but it will grow in a forest condition as well. There is some biocontrol in the research stage, but it's still in that research stage, and usually biocontrol takes, decades to implement. But we have implemented a biocontrol in one of the areas in London with minimal positive effects right now, but I understand it does take several years for that to build up in the area. So we're just in the monitoring stage for that. So again, you can cut the seed pods off. You can pull it, but it generally breaks off at the ground, leaving the root system in the ground unless you have a pretty loose sandy soil. So that's difficult to pull it. You can cut the seed pods off, and what that does is just prevent a seed crop for the next year. It is labor intensive and it's a short-term solution. Again, it can be used in small, sparse populations or single stem, small grouping populations as well. But we generally lean towards the herbicide as well. And that's one theme you'll see here is the quote necessary evil of using a herbicide for a lot of these conditions, especially when we have acres and acres and acres and acres of these species. So that's just it's just the nature of the sites that we're working on. So we treat as early in the season as possible. It is effective, it's efficient, but again, there's some soil contamination. You need licensed exterminators, and we are doing a full year spray in this area. So we do have a lot of other environmental impacts to consider here for sure. Japanese knotweed is the most, in my 25 plus years, it is the most difficult species to control. It'll grow anywhere. It'll push up concrete and pavement. It'll break through foundations. It is super persistent after treatment, even with herbicides. Spreads super rapidly by the rhizomes, long 20 plus foot long roots. It does spread by seed as well, but mainly by the rhizomes. And the timing is really critical with this here as a control method. So we have tried manually removing it. It does not work. You cannot cut it before you do any spraying as well, because your crown to root ratio is slightly off, and you will only top kill it and you won't kill the entire root system from our experience. You can mechanically remove it. What I mean by that is use a machine, a backhoe or an excavator, large machine. You do need to remove a lot of soil material. I would say minimum a meter deep of soil in order to get all the root system out and to control this. So again, we're going back to herbicide here. We can spray it if we need to, but we can also inject the individual stem with herbicide, which is very localized application. It takes a lot more time, but can be used near highly sensitive areas as well. So it's not as much impact or issue for the exterminator as well, the applicator. So because it is so localized, so it's a really good method to use. As long as the patch is not too big that's prevents you from doing that. It's prohibitive for doing that. So move on to giant hogweed here. I'm going to try to go a little bit quicker here just in the interest of time. Giant hogweed is toxic to humans. It does have that photosensitivity with the sun on your skin. So it prefers, those riparian areas along water courses, usually high traffic areas for recreation, fishing, canoeing, kayaking, that kind of thing. Can put out over 100,000 seeds. It grows really quickly. It lives for about anywhere from 2 to 4 years, but generally 2 to 3 mainly. So it comes up in the first year as a rosette. Second or third year, mostly second year, it'll put a flower out, and then that individual plant will die and it won't come back. It is the seeds that it puts out that is the issue moving forward, because they can usually get carried downstream in a spring flood situation, and the seeds can be deposited further downstream, and the whole patch in the population and the issue can reoccur downstream for years. So it can travel long distances. So this is a really nasty plant. So you'll see some of the identification features here, purple blotches on the stem, as though you've taken a paintbrush and dipped it in purple paint and splattered it on the green stem. Very coarse hairs on the stem as well. 50 plus flower stalks here on the flower, and that is indicative of giant hogweed. There's a few other features, but those are very, very key to identifying giant hogweed. You can remove them in the spring if you get them early enough in sort of second, third week of April into the first week of May, and you can dig them up when they're small enough, and then just flip them over in the hole, and usually you've got that covered. You can foliar spray them early in the spring as well. That's another option. And as the season moves on, you can foliar spray them or inject them as the stems get bigger. In the summertime, if they do have flower heads on it and you have no other option to remove that plant, you can cut the flower heads off and put them in black plastic for 72 plus hours, and then dispose of them in the landfill. Just a little bit about some giant hogweed lookalikes. Cow parsnip is one. You can see here not as heavy purple blotching, and the hairs are not quite as coarse on the top right picture. The leaves in the top left are a little bit different, not quite as aggressive looking as giant hogweed. And then on the bottom left, you'll see the flower there, and it has less than 50 flower stalks. And those are generally some really good ID features for cow parsnip and giant hogweed. Cow parsnip does have similar toxicity effects as giant hogweed. It's just that it's not as widespread as giant hogweed, and the plants don't grow as big. They're not as invasive. They don't put out nearly the amount of seeds, just basically the sheer size and number of the seed heads. Common hogweed is another plant that's a lookalike to giant hogweed. It's in our area. Heracleum spondylum, and that's another plant that does have similar effects to both the others. They're all in the carrot family, but this one again is a lot less aggressive, a lot less invasive, and a lot smaller. Doesn't put out nearly the seed heads as well, the seed amounts. So these plants are considered more of a lookalike and not as big a threat as giant hogweed. Angelica does not have any of the toxic effects as giant hogweed. You'll notice it has a globular seed head or flower head and a hairless stem. It's a smooth hairless stem, more of a purpley hue than purple blotches. As soon as you see that, you know it's Angelica and it's a native species, and there's no issue with no toxicities with Angelica. So really good to have across the landscape. I want to go through Phragmites a little bit here. Phragmites is one of the worst invasive species globally. From a sheer biodiversity perspective, it invades coastal and inland wetlands, ditches, roadsides, railways, municipal drains, you name it. It's Phragmites is everywhere. And it does thrive on disturbed sites when it can move inland, and that's how it moves inland, is those disturbed sites. So if you have a ditch that gets cleaned out along the roadside that previously didn't have Phragmites, a good chance you'll get frag in that roadside ditch moving forward. Severely decreases biodiversity, destroys wildlife habitat, especially species at risk that are very prevalent in those coastal and inland wetlands and lagoons and waterways. So also decreases the recreational opportunities and property values along those coastal wetlands, cottage areas, and even, and like I mentioned before, there's a lot of issues with along roadsides and parking lots with line of sight issues, safety issues. You get this dead biomass along a railway, and all it takes is one spark in the middle of summer, where we have these super dry summers now. One spark from a rail, a train, to ignite a pretty decent fire along these rail lines with Phragmites. So that's a big concern for the rail lines in our area. Most of the biomass is actually underground in the massive root systems. So it does reproduce by seeds, but again, mainly, much like the Japanese knotweed, mainly by root rhizomes. And these roots can be 25 to 40 feet long. I've seen them come up out of the ground, run along the surface of the ground, and then back down in the ground again. So really aggressive plant. The seeds can be dispersed by air, wind, water, wildlife, equipment, boats, trailers, ATVs. So, when we're going through these areas, we really have to be careful about using a clean equipment protocol when we leave these areas of high invasive infestation and go to another area, whether it's back to our homes or up to our cottage, or transporting wood or transporting these plants or species around. We really have to be careful how we do that. Lots of different options to control Phragmites. I mentioned the herbicide. We do have glyphosate and imazapyr herbicide for terrestrial applications, and Habitat Aqua was approved 2 years ago for aquatic application pending a permit from MECP. So those are just tools in the toolbox, depending on your area, your comfort level, the species at risk, or the species that are in your area as well. You can manually cut it, only really in small stands, super labor intensive. It's not very effective as a standalone method. So you're going to want to use cutting only in conjunction with another method. Mechanical is really difficult to do because, again, like Japanese knotweed, you've got to take out so much of the root system, so much soil to get all the root system that's really not economically or ecologically viable in most cases. So you may be able to do small isolated stands. You can remove it, but it's really difficult in these large stands. You can drown it. So you can cut it below the water surface, either using a raspberry cane cutter or some type of mechanized equipment, a hedger on a pole kind of thing. And you can cut it to drown. It does thin the patch out, and it repeated treatments annually, and it can thin it out significantly. Goes a long way to that management. Tarping is really only good in small areas. It's really highly labor intensive and really expensive. So it's really, really good for small patches, but that's about it. Biological, there's not really an established biological control yet. There's lots of folks, academia, working on it in the US and Canada, but it's not really out there yet. It's going to take several years. Spading is also an option too, where you can basically cut just below the ground, the root and the stalk that just comes below the ground. You slice that off with a shovel. And again, similar to the drowning method, it does thin it out. But it will not eradicate it in a few years. It does take several years of treatment with those manual methods. There's different optimal timing windows for all these different methods here. Again, the Ontario Invasive Plant Council has a great BMP and technical document that talks about all of these management control methods and the timing for them. There's permitting for some of them that's required. So definitely there's lots of options depending on the size of patch and where you are and the species you have and the available funds and resources you have to control frag. Considering the time, I'll just blast over emerald ash borer. It's largely left our area, or it's not in a really high population anymore. Eastern Ontario and up in Northern Ontario, the Sioux and Thunder Bays, they're definitely dealing with more of a population of emerald ash borer. So we did use triazine to control it, drill holes along the base of the tree, and you can put these nozzles in with a canister of triazine. Triazine is a naturally occurring product from the neem tree, and it's in the native country for the emerald ash borer. So we've used that to some success, but again, this is a program you have to keep doing every 2 years for 10 plus years in order to keep those trees alive until the majority of the emerald ash borer population moves out of that area. So again, it's very time consuming, very expensive, and probably used for single trees in parks and residential areas to keep those alive. Talk about spongy moth a little bit, formerly called gypsy moth. The spongy moth goes on a 7 to 10, 12-year cycle, usually defoliates the tree. You can see the list of species that is the concern of spongy moth. And really what we're looking for is these pale yellow, tan colored egg masses on the trees. Those egg masses, once you see those, you can scrape them off with a butter knife or a putty knife or something like that. Pretty much what you're doing is you're preventing all those egg masses from growing. But if you can't reach the crown of the tree where a lot of the egg masses are, you're going to be making some progress, but in the end, not a lot. It's a feel good thing to do, but it's if you can't get up into the crown, it's very difficult to control the species. You can spray this with a product called BTK, which is a naturally occurring fungus in the soil, and that BTK will kill off the caterpillars of this moth. However, the other piece to this is that there is a natural virus that affects the caterpillars. If you let the population of spongy moth get really high, once it crests to a high population, if your trees are in good health and can withstand it, that high population will bring along the virus in that population, and that'll crash within a couple of seasons. So oftentimes spraying that BTK has a bit of a negative effect and can actually prolong the infestation. It just depends on how healthy your trees are to begin with. If they're very healthy and vigorous to begin with, then you might want to wait till a few years to see if that population crashes due to that virus. If your population of trees have are a little bit weaker or fragile for one reason or another, then spraying that BTK could be an option. And again, it just talks about some of the large and small scale sites to your options of how to control spongy moth. We all know about invasive goldfish. I won't really talk about the biology of goldfish here in the interest of time, but huge economic impact to goldfish have on commercial fishing and native aquatic species as well as the fish reproduction population. So we have done some goldfish removal with electrofishing in the past. But it is a very, very difficult fish to control, to species to control. And now, with the onset of Asian carp, it can be very difficult to control it, just the sheer size and the reproductive capacity of these fish. For example, this is the Sifton Bog here in London, where we did have a high population of goldfish years ago. That's an acidic bog where your native species, pike and trout and species like that wouldn't normally survive in this, but goldfish thrive in it. So they can thrive in low oxygen levels, wide temperature ranges, no vegetation, and heavy vegetation patches as well. So that's what makes these so invasive. So with goldfish, a couple of things here just to remember: do not release them into the wild or flush them down the toilet or the drain. Consider rehoming them, bring them back to the pet store, which I'm understanding now is not a great option. A lot of them won't take them back. You can donate them to a school or another institution if they have an aquarium. There's other things you can do as well, but I'll speak to folks offline about that. But when you're traveling in the backcountry, in campgrounds, in rural areas, in urban wetlands and ponds and rivers, inspect the boats, the canoes, kayaks for these fish eggs and for goldfish for travelers that you pick up. That's that clean equipment protocol a little bit, but inspect your equipment when you leave those areas before you go to another area to make sure you're not transporting them from one area to the other. There's lots of aquatic invasive plants in our area. Two that we've dealt with is water hyacinth and water lettuce. Thankfully, these can be manually removed with a rake or a pool skimmer, that kind of thing. So it does take some labor and monitoring and a lot of repeated treatments, but they can be dealt with fairly easily. So those are two aquatic plant species that we've dealt with over the years. Key to successful program is monitoring. Confirm the effectiveness of your control, look at possible side effects. It's a learning tool to adjust your program going forward. It's a planning tool for the next phase of management. And then it also serves as leverage for funding. If you have a strong monitoring program, it's a lot easier to get funding to show what you've done and that your control is working, your monitoring is working. It's really key. Document, document, document. As I mentioned earlier, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. And that's also critical for, acquiring and leveraging funding as well. and proving to your managers and their funding sources that your management program and what you've done to adapt is working. Make sure you inventory your desirable plants, the ones you want to keep, you're protecting from these invasive species. Have a good idea of what's there. And then also we want to monitor that area after for any side effects in those species. And it's a good idea to use GPS and map them. Take lots of pictures, lots of documents. In the planning phase of your management program, consider restoration. It's really important. It's often overlooked. But also, I just want to highlight here that, don't be so quick to go in and rush in and plant right after your management, just because of that allelopathy and some of the shading and soil restoration. It can take a few years for your soil to recover if you're dealing with plants. It depends on the size of the site, though. It depends on the density of the patch that you're dealing with. So you may be able to start with some restoration and just work slowly over the first couple of years after your management's been completed. There may not be required restoration as well. You may have really, really, really high residual ecosystem health, depending on the forest community or the vegetation community that's there. You have to look at all those factors and figure out what type of restoration is necessary at all, if at all. A lot of these ecosystems, they're very resilient and they'll actually come back on their own with little intervention. So just keep that in mind. Key points: always using the integrated pest management approach. Herbicides are a very effective control method. Using the least amount of herbicide, always follow the label of the herbicide when you're using it. They are a necessary evil, unfortunately, for a lot of these situations. But mechanical and manual can be used. It's labor intensive, timing is critical, usually repeat treatments, but it can be used, especially in smaller sites or dense populations. Monitoring is really, really key, as well as restoration potentially, or consideration for restoration. And make sure you're IDing your plants, both the invasive and the residual plants you want to keep. Make sure you identify them. That's really important to know what you're pulling or what you're controlling. I'm going to skip this slide, but I want to focus on this slide here. And these are some species that are already in our area. In 2016, when I developed this presentation first, hemlock woolly adelgid was not here. Oak wilt was just being talked about. Spotted lanternfly, wild boar, and beech leaf disease was not here either. Now we, other than the spotted lanternfly, we have all of these in our area. And they're really, really highly invasive species to our ecosystems. So, take some time to learn about them. And some of the identification features and some of the things you can see. And, if you see it, take a picture, put it on ed maps, and then the practitioners will have a good idea of its spread, at least. And with this is a picture of kudzu from the US, I think Utah. And this is the kind of thing we're trying to prevent is, we only had kudzu in one area in Leamington that I know of in Ontario. And if it ever gets a hold here, it will make all of our invasives here look like nothing. But this is kind of what we're trying to prevent when we're looking at invasive species management. With that, I'll just say if we have any questions, I'm willing to stay here past 3 o'clock as well. And as well, I can, you can email me with questions if we don't have time to answer them today. I just say thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. I think that was a really comprehensive look at invasive species, particularly ones that are prevalent here in the city of London and the surrounding area. So I appreciate your presentation and your time for speaking with us. We do have some
Certainly.
questions in the chat.
Okay.
I've made it now so that if anybody wants to unmute to ask a question, you are able. But I can ask on behalf of Paula. Her question is about the newer method related to buckthorn with cutting the entire tree or shrub at about 4 inches. Then the following year, when it resprouts, recutting the top growth. And I think she's interested in knowing whether that's been something that you've heard of, have tried, or had any success with.
Yes, we've definitely tried that. And again, in smaller patches, thinner patches, you can do that. What that's going to do is it's going to reduce the energy of the root system, and eventually that plant will die out. But it will take, probably 2, 3, 4 times a year for several years for that to work, because they're really persistent, that root system. So you can do that and keep cutting it and keep cutting it and keep cutting it until it dies out. I know there's people that have done these buckthorn baggies where it's like a heavy black plastic bag, and you cut the stem, leave a bit of a stump, wrap the stump in a plastic bag, or in a single tree situation in someone's backyard. You can put a 5-gallon pail with a brick on it over top of it, and that kind of prevents the sun from reaching that stump and initiating those sprouts. So those are methods that can work. There's lots of issues with the buckthorn baggies. The zip ties come off, people rip them off. In a floodplain, they'll come off as well. So there's lots of issues with them. They'll sprout outside, or if you don't put the baggie right to the ground, they can sprout underneath the baggie and kind of come out. So there's definitely issues, but you can cut it and keep cutting it. It's just, it will take several times a year for several years. And
Mm.
in a smaller stand or a sparse stand, that's maybe manageable, like in the homeowner sort of side of things. From our perspective, when we're dealing with, 40 acres of it in one of our ESAs in London, it's difficult to cut them all off. The other thing about cutting them off is if they have berries on them and you cut the stem off and try to pull the stem through the crown, you could be dispersing those berries all over that soil. You've removed the crown, the sun will hit the forest floor, and then those berries potentially could grow. So timing is critical with that.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think I misread that. It was 4 feet instead of 4 inches, but I'm not sure that that changes.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
You're better off actually to do it at about 12 inches above the
Mm.
ground, like a foot above the ground. It's a lot more manageable. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Good to know. Thank you. The next question is from Sue, and
Yep.
she asks, will BTK also target innocent bystanders? And I
Yes.
suppose this relates to
Yep.
your point that there's pros and cons to using these
Yep.
herbicides,
So
pesticides, and whatnot.
other moths and butterflies can be affected by BTK for sure. So that's why when it's employed, you've really got to be careful that you use it at the right stage of infestation of spongy moth. So um, it's definitely a trade-off, and that's something you really have to be careful of. So you know what, that goes back to inventorying your area. What's the size of your area? You weigh the benefits, the pros and cons of, you know, a few trees dying off due to spongy moth. If you have a really high, resilient, healthy tree population before the spongy moth infestation, it likely makes it through. It doesn't look very good for a couple of years. And then there's also the other impact of having the moths, fall in your backyard and on your pools and play equipment and patios and things like that. So there are some considerations. Uh,
Okay, yeah, no,
it
thank you.
will affect non-target species.
Yeah, that's great. I think that also answers Michaela's question. She asked about the long-term effects of using BTK on surrounding species related to growth and reproduction. So I think that,
Long-term effects, I don't know about long-term effects, but um, the impact when you first spray it, yes, it will affect the species then. Um, other non-target species, but long-term effects, I don't know that it has any long-term effects on those species.
hmm. All right, thanks. Someone, let's see, here in the chat, Shelley says that last Saturday, TTLT was reseeding the pulled buckthorn bare soil sites with blue stem ryegrass and mixed native asters. They were thrilled that this practice has been proven to help the situation. And Shelley's asking about your thoughts on this.
Definitely. Yeah, I would rather put in a prairie species, grass and forbs, than trees and shrubs after a initially right after a buckthorn
Mm.
plant control. They just seem to be able to handle that allelopathy a little bit better than some of the trees and shrubs. So the other benefit to that is it captures the site, grows in nice and
Mhm.
thick, helps prevent naturally helps prevent the buckthorn from seeds from germinating and sprouting and growing. And then also will add native seed to the seed bank. So if you want to go in there and plant trees and shrubs after, you'll have that native seed, that prairie forb layer in the seed bank. So yeah, really good. I know that there's a few studies out of the US that have used those forbs and grasses as well as some other ones. So really, really great idea.
Great. Yeah. Um, the next one is from Lori Miller. She says that we have buckthorn along our road en route to the river at Thames Valley Avenue, and the neighborhood would like to help remove it. I think she's interested in next steps as a community member, what we can do to help remove invasive species.
Right. So on if it's on public land like a roadway or a park or that kind of area, you would need to get a hold of the municipality. So in London here, you'd want to talk to the city, whether it's the parks or roads folks, and try to get involved in some neighborhood beautification projects. I know there are a few initiatives in the city, but that would be a question for the City of London for sure. If it's on private land, yep, you can, talk to the private landowners. If it's your land, you can, gather a community group around and put together a plan to remove it. But if it's on public land, you would need to talk to the city about that.
Okay. Yeah. No, good to know.
Yeah.
I think there's Chris and Norma are asking if the area behind the German club is being monitored by the city for contamination. Is it safe to walk there? Is that something that you know anything about?
Yeah, German Club is in the Coves area, and we manage the Coves ESA on behalf of the city. Um, our crew does. And behind the German Club, though, is private property. So we manage sort of the upland or slope area around those ponds, I'll say. But once you get to the parking lot at the German Club, behind that is private property, and then there's the old paint factory on the other side of the creek as well, and that's all private as well. So we don't have any jurisdiction in that area. In the coves, though, the areas that we do manage, we do buckthorn management and other invasive species management. It's just that we do have almost 800 hectares that we manage, so and a certain budget, so we do have to prioritize certain areas. And for control, we did a large buckthorn and autumn olive control program in East Pond of the Coves area a few years ago, and followed it up again. And then we do know we have milfoil in the East Pond as well, especially. So that's something we're looking at controlling as well in the coves.
Okay, great. That was one of the next questions as well. Margaret was asking about the milfoil
Yeah, that's been
in
a
the
problem in
coves.
coves. There's a few other logistical hurdles we have to go through, I'll say, with the milfoil, but it's on our radar for sure, something to control. And there's a volunteer group that we've been working with as well to try to get in there and do some of that to help us out with that. So it's on our radar for sure. Yep.
All right. Well, thanks so much. I think that covers most of the questions. Paula just sent, how do you maintain your motivation and optimism when it's such an unending task? Which I think is maybe a good point to
Yep.
leave off of
Yep. So
as we
what I'll say is never think about it as complete eradication. We're invasive species. Think about it as management. Get it to the point where it's easily, in quotes, easily managed every year. That's the goal. Yes, eradication would be perfect in an ideal situation, but really you want to try to look at it as a management piece as opposed to as opposed to just flat out eradication. The other piece is I use this quick analogy is that I know somebody who had a community event pulling garlic mustard in the Barrie area. What they did was they had a huge coniferous stand full of garlic mustard, and what they ended up doing was they would use drainage flags to stake out small plots, 10 meters by 10 meter plots, and they would label them. They'd scatter these plots spread out across the whole stand, and they would, volunteers would show up in groups of 3 or 4, and they would say, okay, you have stand 2, 6, and 27. they would go to these squares and they would focus on just this smaller patch. And then they go to patch 6 and focus on that. And they go to patch 27 and focus on that. And then before they knew it, an hour and a half later, what they thought was going to take them an entire day, they were done in an hour and a half or 2 hours. They'd come back and say, okay, I want some more plots. And they'd give them 2 more plots. So you need to focus on a certain area, use natural or physical boundaries for plots, put your management plan reasonable for that year, what you can do. And if you achieve more, fantastic. But you just have to make sure you're reasonable and achievable. And that's the biggest goal. And then like I said, the optimism is just knowing that you're not alone. There's lots of people trying to manage invasive species. There's lots of connections can be made. So yeah, there's a large community out there to get involved in.
Great. Thanks so much. I
You're
think
welcome.
that we will leave it off there. I know in the chat we brought up iNaturalist as another option
Yeah.
to doing that monitoring, and I think that I think we both agree that
Yes.
any sort of monitoring is good and moves us in the right direction.
That's key.
So,
Yeah, that's key for sure.
all right. Well, thank you so much. I
You're
think
welcome.
we have overdone our time, so I will let you go and let our attendees go. But before we head out, I wanted to thank you again for the important work that you're doing and for being here today to talk about it, to share that with us. I would like to extend thanks to Natural Resources Canada for funding our webinar series, being able to host events like this. So if you've enjoyed attending this webinar, we do have one next week as well, called Broadcasting the Seeds of Restoration with Thames Talbot Land Trust. So we look forward to seeing you there. And I see that, Brandon, you've put your
Yep.
contact in the chat, so anyone with any follow-up questions can maybe reach out to you.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thanks
Thanks
so much.
everybody
Have
for
a great
attending.
day, everyone.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks.